So previously we learned about ionic bonding, and now we're going to learn about what we call ionic nomenclature, which is just a fancy way of saying, how do I name an ionic bond? That's what nomenclature is, naming. So to name an ionic compound, you first have to remember how you know if a compound is ionic. We know because ionic compounds are made up of a metal and a nonmetal. So the first thing that you're going to do is write the metal element first, and then you'll write the non-element second. You will replace the ending of your non-metal or your anion with IDE, only if there's no polyatomic ion present. If the compound contains a polyatomic ion, just use the full out name of the polyatomic. If the compound contains a transition metal, you have to identify the charge and use a Roman numeral in parentheses. So examples of naming an ionic compounds, sodium chloride is one we'll use all the time. Sodium, you just write out the word sodium, and then you write out the word chlorine, and you change the ending to IDE. So it becomes chloride. So again, for practice, you would write the name of the metal cation. In this case, this is potassium. The name of the non-metal anion, oxygen. You're going to change the ending to IDE, so it would become oxide. Then you put it all together, so it is potassium oxide. So go ahead and give that some practice. We're not worried about the subscripts right now. We're just practicing writing out the name of the metal and the non-metal and then merging them together. I'll give you about 2 minutes. Oops, sorry. Okay, great. So that was 2 minutes to figure out how we name these. So again, you just write out the metal, aluminum, magnesium, sodium, magnesium, lithium, and then you write out the non-metal and change the ending to IDE. Bromide, oxide, nitride, chloride, fluoride. So how do we name compounds with polyatomic ions? Normal ions end in IDE. Polyatomic ions end in ate and ite, with the exceptions of cyanide, hydroxide, and ammonium. Polyatomic ions have more than one capital letter because they have more than one element. So an example of this is calcium, carbonate. So all you do is just write out the polyatomic ion in its polyatomic ion form. So if you're not familiar or if you're not sure, just use the chart, which is on your reference table. How do we name compounds with transition metals? Transition metals have varying charges, which means that they require Roman numerals for naming. So an example of this is cobalt chloride. Cobalt is a transition metal with a charge of 2. So we would write in Roman numerals a 2. The weird thing about transition metals is that their charges can change, which can make writing their formulas a little difficult. But we know that certain things have to be true. The entire compound must have an overall charge of 0 because it has to be neutral. And you will always know the charge of the anion because anions don't change charges. So to name a compound with a transition metal, you just write out the chemical symbols of each element. Don't forget the subscripts. Write out the charge of the anion. And then you're going to calculate the overall charge. And the overall charge is just the number of atoms multiplied by the charge of the atom. So if I have, for example, aluminum, and I have 2 atoms of aluminum, then I have an overall charge of 6 because aluminum has a charge of 3, and there are 2 aluminum atoms. And then you would place the charge of the transition metal in parentheses using Roman numerals. So for an example, people who like numbers, you have iron and oxygen. Okay, so you have 2 atoms of iron and you have 2 atoms of oxygen. Iron in this example, or oxygen in this example, we know has a specific charge. Does anybody remember the specific charge of oxygen? Okay, so if you said -2, then you're right. Iron has a charge of -2. And there are 3 atoms of, I'm sorry, oxygen has a charge of -2. And there are 3 atoms of oxygen, which means that the overall charge is -6. That means that iron also needs to end up with an overall charge of +6 because +6 will cancel out the -6. So I have 2 iron atoms, and that means that each of these iron atoms has to have a charge of +3. So I would write that +3 in parentheses. So if you're visual, we can do tin and oxygen, and we can draw it as a picture of atoms. So we have 1 tin and 3 oxygens. Again, oxygen has a charge of -2. There are 3 of them, so that means that I have a total charge of -6. Tin also has to have an overall charge of +6 in order to cancel out. Because there's only 1 atom, that means that this entire atom of tin must have a charge of +6 because +6 and -6 cancel each other out. So go ahead and practice this, and then that will be the last thing that we do today. And if you need some assistance, you are more than welcome to stay behind after class for tutoring. If not, I will see you guys later.